Welcome to episode 34 of the International Web Effectiveness Podcast, where Bill Hunt and I, Bill Scully, focus on the strategies and techniques necessary to improve your web presence and manage your global websites. In episode 33, we talked about geographical targeting and the challenges of search engines trying to understand the target market of your website and the difficulties of interpreting geographic signals. Similar implications are present in this episode where we discuss actions companies take to be found by domestic companies looking for new suppliers. The tariff fluidity has really gone back and forth over the last month, going where it was the end of the world to dialing it back, then turning it on for China and giving some other places some different benefits. But Bill, you created a couple posts and articles on both sides of the problem. Companies looking for supplies and supplies looking for buyers. Why don't you tell us a little bit about why you did that?
So my thought is that, when companies being hit with 145% tariff to bring in their parts from China, they're going to look somewhere. And we were trying to give two solutions. How do you look domestically? What are some tools you can use? What are ways to find domestic partners? And then maybe the alternative is actually looking at nearshore or, maybe markets that have lower tariff, options. So again, this whole reason that during the Trump's first administration, so much business went to Vietnam and Cambodia and Bangladesh as people were trying to uncouple from Chinese supply chains over the tariffs at that point. And so as we were digging into that, I happened to see a news episode where a couple of American furniture makers in Vermont, I think they were both in Vermont, maybe one was in New Hampshire, it said, everything about our product is American except the hardware. The fasteners or the little brass, rings on drawers and stuff, hinges, we can only find that at the price point we needed from China. And they said we were looking for alternatives for this. And then only one of them actually clarified we're looking at other offshore alternatives. So I was looking, okay, what if I wanted onshore, and so I actually went to my dining room table and looked underneath it and looked to see what kind of hardware we had. And one I saw was a brass carriage bolt. And then it had some other where we can take the leaf out. And so I went to Google and I put that in. I think it was American made. And I called this article Invisible at the Worst Time, Why American Manufacturers Are Losing the Tariff Opportunity. And my query was American made brass carriage bolts, very specific. And there was 3 paid ads and only one of them mentioned that had any reference to the US, said shop American made fasteners. So 2 of them didn't. So here I'm paying, and my query was American made or whatever variation you want to use. The other guys hadn't jumped on this opportunity to get in front of this and say, hey, we've got American made stuff for people specifically looking for it. And then in the paid, there was nobody that said they were American made. And I thought this was interesting. And, there was names like Patriot and, US Bolt and a couple other, they weren't in the top 5, but they were, in the remaining set. A lot of them had really bad snippets. It brought in sizes. And what was interesting was as I went to these trying to see how many were American made, I couldn't really find any that were indicating that they were making them in America. I went to their About Us page. I went to the homepage. I was mentioning, before we got started, one was it's like they had found an American flag, template for their theme for their WordPress site. And, everything was Star Spangled Banner, red, white, and blue.
Yeah.
But even then, there was no mention to being American made. And finally, in the history of the founder, he mentioned he'd set up the company 65 years ago in, I don't know, somewhere in middle America. And so I was like, wow, this is insane. Why aren't companies doing this? And what I deduced was there's 3 key problems that I saw. number one was a search terminology disconnect. I'm just going to start with that one. And this has two flavors. People either weren't saying they were American made, or they were using a more brand forward, or as like I'm the anti-marketer marketer. Like I don't like flowery phrases and cool taglines and stupid things like that, like made in heart America. What does that mean? That was on a site when I went to I Googled who makes anything in America. And these guys were paraded out as they're predominantly American made or American assembled.
Hmm.
And that's the only reference they had to that was this, big bold tagline from a commercial on their, factory page. Others were proudly American made. Again, a disconnect with how people might search. Now, if we throw in the procurement problem, procurement people are going to be looking at words like U.S. origin, domestic supplier, things like that are specifically looking for an indication that you're producing these in the United States, or at least assembling products. Right? So
Yeah.
that was the biggest gap. And in the article, we which we'll talk about, a whole host of recommendations. The second gap was, SEO's calling, and what's the saying? It's like 1998 SEO is calling. And again, I get it. These guys are some of them got to be multi-million dollar manufacturers.
Yeah.
And, they've got a site at the bottom, made by, cousin Steve. And, I'm just going to leave it at that. But, some company that clearly chucked out a website that probably works for them, but, again, doesn't have any reference to American made. Only 3 of the top 10 results in Google for these phrases had schema. So there was no pricing, there was no other elements showing up in the search results, let alone something Google could use. I didn't find anybody that was using things like country of origin or country of assembly schema tags on their product pages.
I didn't know there was a country of assembly schema tag. Good to know.
So it's out there, and you can flag it as the U.S. Same thing, even putting in the NAICS, the North American Industry Code for what you make.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I originally, one of my goals out of my grad school program was to build this whiz bang, find companies that had products that were exportable, and then reach out to them to say, hey, you have an exportable product based on XYZ variables. You should think about exporting. Trying to back into that is pretty painful. But again, putting that code, I did see some search queries around different codes, because people, if you have that code, you're in that industry.
Yeah.
Right. So there are people in the know would use that. And then the third one, I could not find any of these. Again, I didn't search for these in particular, but none of the 3 verticals that I looked in, like these carriage bolts and some other pieces of hardware. And what was the third type of widget? Oh, it was like plastic gears was another one where I saw an article that they make a component that requires plastic gears. And they said they could only get them from China. And nobody was messaging what I called messaging to the moment. I didn't find any of the sites that I went to had anything about, they were actually cheaper. And in the article, I cite a research report, or what would you call it? A survey from last month, where 74% of companies said costs were the number one reason why they weren't sourcing American products.
Yeah, so I have some history on that. So I actually worked with a pretty large tarp manufacturer, and it was all American made, and they were I wouldn't call them premium priced, but they could not get a new visit to purchase, and we think it was just because of price and not having a big brand yet. So in that case, it was plastered all over the site that they were American made. And then I have another company that actually had more sales, but it was because of the Build America, Buy America. It was a thing that Biden had put in place for stricter rules for infrastructure. He wanted more infrastructure spending done with American companies, which makes sense because you don't want to
Yeah,
have a foreign company. You don't want to depend on a foreign
totally.
company if you don't get along with them anymore.
But the question is, did, not necessarily on the end user side, but on the person that's either using components or is, assembling or, needs components from somewhere to do this, have they looked? I mean, that could be the interesting question. Maybe they haven't looked at this. Like there was an article I read Sunday in the paper. It was a pencil company in Tennessee. And, right out of the gate, he says, I needed to lower my costs. So I get the wood, some kind of poplar wood. I get it from China. It's cheaper than getting that same wood from the United States,
That's amazing. Is that
right?
just think of all of the logistics to get a piece of wood here, and it's cheaper.
Right.
Never,
Now, the graphite, I
never mind the
understand.
cost to in gas and whatever else it takes to transport it. Just the logistics, and it's cheaper. That's
Right.
nuts.
I mean, look at some of the chicken poultry companies. We're looking at, basically, killing the chickens, flash freezing them, sending them to China to be processed, where China might take the feet and a couple other components that they want, and then doing all the slicing, packaging, and then sending it back. You can't even. I mean, how is that cheaper? But the
Nuts.
point is that so many people, 74%, that was the reason. My question is, did they even try to source it or not? If they did and they know. And then the other thing the guy said about the pencils was there is no American manufacturer of graphite in the United States. That China was the dominant manufacturer of graphite that was used in pencils.
Hmm.
So it's that's the only game in town. And so, like he's saying, look, he may have to shut down because who's going to pay a premium on this? Now, the first thing I think people will say, well, who the hell is using pencils? Will anybody taking an SAT or
Right.
any other Scantron
We got
type
a
test?
voter card.
People are still using pencils. Golfers still using pencils, those nubby little pencils.
Yeah.
And that's what he was saying. That's how he had to diversify, was to go after, stubby pencils and, contractor pencils, those flat ones that
Yeah.
that they
Woodworker.
have, things like that. But anyways, you mentioned a couple of these, right? The whole thing is, if you find something, can you remove any of these other variables? Like just the fluidity, now we're back down to 30%.
Hmm.
So we ping ponged all over the place just in China alone. And so the companies just don't know where to turn. Like I've talked to people that their manufacturer of the thing that they were buying won't even talk to them, won't even do a deal because of the uncertainty and things like that. So now so again, but the other things are, tariff fluctuation, delivery times, the boats coming into just the port of Long Beach and is down, I think, 35%. So you may not be able to get them out of China pretty easily. Or, the rule of law, contracts, a whole host of things that paying a premium or even a slight premium over what you're paying to make a lot of that pain and suffering go away may be a reason to look at, buying from the United States. The second side of this article, which I still need to put out, is the whole idea of alternative markets or nearshoring. Can you get it from somewhere? Nearshoring's out of the question because that means it's Canada or Mexico, which have been hammered as well. But can you get it from somewhere else? And like you said, that's a whole new can of worms with contracts and what happens if we get pissed at that country and raise their tariffs and again all the things that we talked about. So at the end of the day, those were the three things that I saw that weren't in place. Even if you were the low than 145% tariff version of a product, you may not get seen because the way people are looking for this are not there. So we came up with a variety of, recommendations. So anything you want to add to why it might be better or easier? Better is the wrong word. Not the, buy American for America's sake or American job, but just any other economic or
I was trying to uncover some intent for buy USA, but I really think the intent is replace a supplier or reduce your costs.
that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
Right. And that was the urgency that we put this out because, people have this problem today.
Yeah.
And like on the news.
And there, I mean, companies don't really want to lean on being a low cost provider, but this is a great time to get some new customers.
Right.
And normally when you look at a website, there is no indication of what things cost.
Right.
And there's no it would probably make sense to have, something in your brand that says high quality, reasonable cost.
Right. Or again, targeting any of these reasons, the messaging around it. Right. And the one thing that's interesting, one of the recommendations that we have in here is what we called tariff specific landing pages. So, and these were things like tariff-free manufacturing or U.S. alternative to Chinese plus product name. One of the things that we recommend is potentially a calculator. Like you said, you may not put pricing on there, but you can put ranges.
Yeah.
Right. Here's what we believe the price is with whatever percent tariff markup versus ours.
Right.
I mean, if you're 145% over a Chinese equivalent, you probably have other problems with your business, but, and maybe you are, maybe it's a size thing. Maybe again, your resources are probably going to be a problem for some of these things. Again, we were talking about brass and metal in the one case, but plastics, there were certain types of plastics, certain types of injection molding that I saw some references. Like one guy said his product can only be made in China. And there was one company that just now can potentially make it in Vietnam, but there was nobody doing that type of plastic molding to that level of tolerance, I think was what his exact words were in the United States.
Yeah.
But
and,
to your point,
there's an issue. I hope this all turns out okay, but Americans are not really manufacturing workers. Like people don't want to work in a factory anymore. So in order to spin up a company like that, even if you could, it would take you 2 to 3 years to get the machines from overseas, probably. And then you'd have to train a whole bunch of people that want to do that. I don't know. It's got to be really difficult for these manufacturing companies.
It is. And what's interesting is I have an article that I've shared with some friends that either were confused or were very adamant about the tariffs, that they were an amazing thing. And basically we just needed to suck it up and deal with it. So I sent them, I wrote this article. I haven't posted it publicly, but we went through the logic. And this is really not the format. It's the format, but maybe not the right episode to talk about that. But, we do have I do believe there is an opportunity. If you make something today and you have any kind of capacity, you probably want to make sure people know that you do make it. And so, I love what you were saying about a lot of people don't have price. It's like these bolts, right? I didn't really find anybody that said it's $2 per 100 or per kilo or pound or armful or handful or whatever metric you use to buy bolts. But maybe that calculator, just something to say, hey, we might be able to beat that tariff price. We might tariff price. And then now the US about the same time introduced any non-American flagged ship that comes into a port to offload foreign goods per port visit pays $1 million. I think that goes into effect now or in next week, but sometime in May.
And it's for
non-American flag ships.
Right.
Here's the interesting thing, pop quiz. And I didn't triple check this, but I was curious when I heard that statement and the person said, he made the statement, how many American flagged commercial ships do we have?
I was just wondering that myself. I have
9.
No idea. 9.
And they operate in the Caribbean. because we have a rule similar to your Buy American, Build American, Buy American, to bring goods into like the U.S. Virgin Islands and, to Puerto Rico. It has to be an American flagship. And so it's an interesting thing, right? Is that we just don't have them.
Right.
And so now the shipping company is being hit, or the owner of the ship is being hit with $1 million, to come into the port of Long Beach or a port
For
of
every
Virginia,
port. And
Baltimore, every port.
they probably go to 2 or 3, right? Or more.
Yep. And then that gets, amortized across all of the containers that are on that ship. So there's a whole host of things, like, again, build a calculator, put something up there. Again, some of the things jumping into this, creating these tariff specific landing pages. Some of the ideas we had were highlight the business advantages, total landed cost comparisons with and without tariffs, supply chain reliability, reduce shipping costs, faster lead times, ease of doing business, add a calculator to show the real-time cost impacts if possible. And then as time evolves, generate case studies to demonstrate how you've helped new customers mitigate these tariffs. And then what can you do to overcome? 74% of the people interviewed said they automatically, believe American products are going to be more expensive. So what can you do to offset that perception or reality? Well,
Yeah.
that's when we need to lean into things like total value, risk reduction, resilience, broader business advantages, the fact that you can say they're American made,
The nice thing
assembled in
is
America.
these manufacturing companies have customers. There's a reason for it.
Right.
And they're also very reluctant to share who their customers are. So there may be opportunities to, not just highlight their products, but who their customers are.
Exactly.
I want to remind people of our free Facebook group, where we use that as an opportunity to discuss these things, and you can ask any questions you want. You can also suggest ideas for upcoming podcasts. You can find that by searching International Web Mastery Free Group.
And it's, just to show that, especially if you've got this and if people are looking for it, you want to make sure that you're being found. And so like product pages, like you said, your client has this already where, you're integrating things into titles like made in the USA or tariff-free shipping, American made quality. You can use as headings, try to integrate this in. Again, don't go nuts with over spamming this, but where it makes sense. An interesting thing you can do is similar to like the organic produce example. Create a made in USA badge. They have them available on the web. You can download or license, put it up there and put that there, that these are American made components. And same thing, like you were saying, get them out to your clients to say that they're using American made components. Have descriptions of your U.S. manufacturing process, and that, either on your about page or on your, manufacturing page. It's interesting how many companies don't talk about their American manufacturing story, right? They don't have, that, we started in 1929 coming out of the Depression. We
Making
made this,
horseshoes.
and now we make this, the origin story, right? Showcase the factory, showcase the employees, showcase the process, the origin of materials. This is where you can show memberships, relevant industry codes like the NAICS codes, harmonized tariff codes. All this adds to credibility and boosts your site authority.
So that's something I've never heard of, the harmonized tariff code?
So that is an international code, and that's a code every product category and even some subcategories have this code, that it is the exact code that the tariff is tied to. And, and this is the interesting thing. Tariffs have always been tied individually to harmonized codes, right? When we say, if like a crazy thing is like bananas, right? If you look up the code for bananas, it's going to say, are they ripe bananas? Are they dried bananas? Are they banana puree or whatever banana alteration that you've done?
Wow.
Are they organic? Organic bananas actually have their own harmonized code. And each of these versions have a tariff that we've applied. And that's how we used to do it. If we're like, okay, we don't have a big banana sort of manufacturing or growing base in America. So it's like, yeah, bring them on in. But let's say like tomatoes is the interesting one now. Florida is really trying to wrangle to stop tomatoes from being imported from Mexico primarily. But what's interesting is like Florida tomatoes are tomatoes, the big tomatoes you slice to put on sandwiches. They're not necessarily the tomatoes that are used in like pasta sauce or the
Yeah.
small tomatoes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So again, it's one of these things where because saner people have applied these harmonized codes and tariffs accordingly, we can let the little, tiny bite-sized tomatoes come in, while we penalize the big,
Okay.
flavorless tomatoes that we grow here.
Right.
Send your cards and letters. I await them. But this is why they had these harmonized codes. And so people will, I did see searches on both the NAICS code and the harmonized code for products to find people that were making those items. And that's one of the things we talk about later is being in those directories, people that make these, like the Thomas Register. So again, we've talked about making tariff specific or buy American specific, or, we're, less pain and suffering than importing pages, tweaking the product pages to input schema, the origin or assembly tags, put even in the product ID tags, change your title tags, change your heading tags to incorporate the Made in America component. Update search campaigns. This was one that floored me. Like I said, of all the queries that I did, I only saw one company that had a reference to made in the US or made in America in their paid ad. And the fact that my query had that, right? I'd be looking at every paid campaign. If you want people to buy from you and you have a made American message, do you state that in paid search? You may not have a chance or the money to update your website, but if you're doing paid search, create an ad group specifically around that. So
Yeah.
when
Oh,
people are
yeah.
searching
Yeah. Well,
for American made plus our product.
yeah, there's a dozen different ways you could probably pull it out, right? American built, domestic manufactured, crafted in the USA, born and built in the USA. Those are kind of,
No
you wouldn't
brainers.
want to optimize a page for those terms,
Right.
but to pay for them, just, create a big long list of everything 100% American materials, create a big long list and put it into a paid search campaign.
And we put some in there like made in USA screws for medical equipment, USA made product for OEMs, et cetera, et cetera. It's just, again, when people are putting in those words and that product category, boom, and again, you're directly in front of people and you're at the top of the search results. And I think this is a brilliant way to use paid search. The next one is industry directories, ThomasNet, Global Spec, IndustryNet. These are directories that, companies may go to and look for that component, and they contain, you can filter on them, either North America, you can kick out the Canadian companies and just the American companies. And then the last one, for the sales folks, a monitor set up Google Alerts, Perplexity. Like in the case, the search that I did it after the day on the American furniture people. Perplexity already had that article indexed and, cited it as a reference. And so what I'm saying is media monitoring. Set up some queries in AI agents, set up a Google alert to look for people in an industry that you service and where they're indicating there's any kind of tariff pain and suffering. And then guess what? It's going to give you a list to say these are companies that have said they're being impacted by the tariffs. And especially if you've got something that services them, then now you've got a nice little laundry list that you can start dialing for dollars and reaching out to them. Hey, we make brass placards, or we make this, or we make whatever that they make. I mean, I saw one company that was talking about they assemble the medical equipment and use these specific screws. So it's like if you make those kind of screws, There you go. There's somebody that's already stated that they're feeling the pain of this. And the last thing I want to close with is this. Now is the time, because over time, and I think Bill, you mentioned this. If you can get a few of these folks to at least try you, at least you've sold X. And you've now started a dialogue and a relationship. The worst case is you are still more expensive, or you may not have the quality they're looking for, or whatever. The problem is why they don't buy from you, but at least you can be introduced to these people.
And you could change, depending on what you're buying, you could change your processes, right? So like some people might be buying hardware from one company and plating from another company, and there are companies that do both in the United States. Yeah, there's I'm sure everybody's out there looking. You want to make sure that you're found.
And so, check out the article. We've got a bunch of these recommendations up on International Webmastery. We'll create like a quick checklist for you there of things just to check to make sure you've got these represented. And like always, if you need help with this, reach out to us. We'll be glad to help you work on some of these different things to capture any potential opportunity as a result of the craziness that's out there.
Yeah, and as we spoke in a previous episode, do a search for your company name is made in the United States and see what the answer is.
Yep.
All right, that's great. Thanks, Bill. We hope you're finding value in our conversations. If you're enjoying the show, we'd really appreciate it if you could take a moment and rate and review the podcast. We also want to hear from you. Your feedback really helps motivate us to keep us making these and plan future episodes. So follow International Webmastery on LinkedIn, Facebook, and X, and let us know. Talk to you.
Cool. See you next time.
All right. Thanks, Bill. Take care. Hey, this is Bill Scully. I just wanted to let you know that we have a free training course called Demystifying hreflang. It includes 6 modules and is over an hour long with a quiz at the end of each module. You can find it at internationalwebmastery.com. Hope to see you there.